Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Chesa Boudin. I'm the founding executive director of the Criminal Law and Justice Center here at Berkeley Law School, and I couldn't be more excited about the speakers and the event we have lined up for you today. Before I turn to introducing those speakers and kicking off what I hope will be a really lively and robust conversation with plenty of opportunities for all of you to ask questions as well, I want to start by reading a Berkeley Law civility statement that you'll all be familiar with from other events on campus. Free speech and academic freedom are foundational values in the University of California. UC Berkeley is committed to the belief that speech we may not like or agree with should be confronted with respectful speech rather than censorship. UC Berkeley's principles of community call for civility and respect in our personal interactions. If you would like to express a point of view that is different from what our guests are presenting, you may do so in any area on campus that is open to free public speech. You, of course, may ask questions at the appropriate time. However, you are not permitted to disrupt this event. We ask that you as audience members be respectful of the speakers and students in attendance and refrain from any disruptive behavior. If you attempt to disrupt the event, you will be asked to leave the venue and face possible student disciplinary action. And what better way to end the statement than to talk about discipline, as we have a group of prosecutors here. We know a lot about discipline, traditional and alternative. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to give a big thank you to the Prosecutors Alliance of California, our co-host for this event, the founding executive director of the Prosecutors Alliance. Christine DeBerry is in the front row. Raise your hand. Definitely encourage students here to talk to Christine after the event, or in general, reach out to Prosecutors Alliance. We will talk a little bit more later today about the Prosecutors Alliance, what it is, what it does. And also want to acknowledge and thank Otis Bruce, the Chief Assistant District Attorney from Alameda County, where we're all located, for joining us today. He's in the front row. I hear he is hiring on behalf of District Attorney Pamela Price, who unfortunately her schedule did not allow her to join us today. But definitely those of you looking for jobs and who want to stay local, talk to Otis after the event. With that, let me introduce our speakers and kick it off with a question. To my left, to your right, we have Larry Krasner, and he is well known, certainly in the national media. He has been one of the faces and one of the leaders of the current within the broader criminal justice reform movement that's become known as the progressive prosecutor movement. Larry, like myself and like Monique, who I'll get to in a moment, came into this work from a really non-traditional background. He spent most of his career as a civil rights lawyer defending protesters pro bono who were involved in various progressive protest movements. He has been, in his time in elected office, a champion of bail reform, diversity within his office, ending the death penalty, police accountability, alternatives to incarceration, and so many other areas of reform that are, to put it simply, commonly accepted as best practices within academia, and yet somehow made controversial in mainstream press when an elected official does the work of implementing them and putting them into practice. Larry was first elected as the District Attorney of Philadelphia in 2017, and despite loud and large news headlines predicting his demise and his re-election in 2021, he won re-election overwhelmingly. I think it was upwards of 2/3 of the vote. But if I am taking any percentages away from him, he'll set the record straight, I have no doubt. To my right, to your left, we have Monique Worrell, who was elected as the state's attorney for the 9th Judicial Circuit of Florida back in January of 2021. Like Larry, her background is not as a traditional career prosecutor, but rather she was the founding director of the University of Florida College of Law's Criminal Justice Center and the state attorney's conviction integrity unit. In other words, she spent part of her time prior to becoming a prosecutor making sure that justice was done retroactively in cases where wrongful convictions might have occurred, and thinking strategically about how to prevent wrongful convictions from occurring in the future. Her election in 2021, when I was serving as District Attorney of San Francisco, was a really critical counterpoint to a dishonest national narrative about the failure or the kind of demise of the criminal justice reform movement. Lots of media outlets love to talk about, and certainly my recall was part of this narrative, the idea that the movement has peaked and we're on the downhill and our policies and platforms are not popular. In fact, Monique's election in 2021 was a very important counterpoint to that narrative, and the fact that getting her out of office required Governor DeSantis to summarily remove her undemocratically, I believe illegally, is also a counterpoint to that narrative. This is not democratic. This is not what the people of Orlando and the Ninth Judicial Circuit wanted. They wanted her, and we are lucky to have her with us today. So I want to start with a fairly open-ended question for both of you, and that is something I've already touched on, which is that you come from non-traditional backgrounds. Neither one of you came up through the ranks as career prosecutors, and yet you made the decision to run for and then win the office of District Attorney, State's Attorney. Let me start with you, Monique, and then we'll move to you, Larry. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, why you think it suited you for that role, and why it is that you ultimately found meaning in your professional work as an elected prosecutor?
Yes, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you this afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me. I think that I was great for the job because I never aspired to be a politician. There are so many people who go through life with aspirations of being a politician, and usually it's based on themselves and what they want out of life. But for me, I spent 20 years as a defense attorney, and part of that time also as a law professor, as a public servant. So I served the public for my entire career. I started as a public defender right out of law school, and I knew that that was the job that I went to law school to do. And after being a public defender, I went into private practice where I continued to practice criminal law, and then I had an opportunity to go work at the University of Florida College of Law, where I ultimately started and founded our criminal justice center and ran the criminal clinics. And in 2018, my predecessor, Aramis Ayala, the first African-American female elected in the state of Florida, the first African-American ever elected as a prosecutor in the state of Florida, asked me to come and lead her conviction integrity unit. So I left University of Florida at that time to go and do that. And having spent, at that point about 17, 18 years as a defense attorney, what I learned as director of the conviction integrity unit was that some of my worst fears about what was happening on the other side were true. That people were in fact being wrongfully convicted. That in the state of Florida, we led the nation in wrongful conviction and in exonerations from death row. There were 30 people in the state of Florida who had been sent to death row who were later exonerated and found not to have committed the crimes that they were sentenced for at all. So after doing that, I left for a brief period of time and came back. My predecessor decided that she wasn't going to run for re-election. And I didn't think that I could actually win. I got in the race because I felt like it was important for the people who were running to answer very important questions to the community, to talk about mass incarceration and the fact that in the United States we incarcerated more people than anywhere in the world, to talk about the disproportionate representation in mass incarceration, to talk about the fact that at that point in time, less than 2% of elected prosecutors were African American, right? So these were hard discussions that needed to be had, and I wanted to force the individuals running for that seat to have those discussions. And in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, it changed the race in my favor, because then we also had to talk about police brutality. We also had to talk about the murders of innocent African Americans at the hands of law enforcement. And that was a space that I was familiar with because it was something that I had talked about and taught about and protested about for most of my career. And I think that was the defining moment in my campaign. And in August of 2020, I won my primary election and then the general in November of 2020 and took office in January of 2021.
Thank you, Larry.
Well, hi, everybody. So, number one, I want to introduce my team very quickly, and we'll go from there because we're here to recruit. Yes, that's right. Just like Mr. Bruce of Pamela Price's office, we are here to recruit. I have with me Robert Listenby, a graduate of this proud institution. Now you have to cheer for all of them. Mr. Listenby is not only my first assistant, he was Barack Obama's chief of juvenile justice during his second term. We have with us Helena Von Nedge, who just graduated from here in 2022. And is ripping it up in the trial courts of Philadelphia doing justice. And we also have Sarah Boyette, who wears many hats, including the hat of crusading expert in state-of-the-art Brady practices, meaning give the other side what the Constitution says they need to get. So you don't put all those innocent people in jail like they did in Philly and like they did in Florida. My history, simplified, is after college, I was on a death penalty jury as a juror when I was 23 years of age. I went to law school knowing I was going to want to do criminal justice, but really very open to being either a prosecutor or a defense attorney on the theory that you could do good work if you worked hard and had a moral compass. And so I interviewed all over the country with both offices, but I was much more comfortable in 1987 with the public defenders, and frankly, much more comfortable many years after that. I was a county defender for 3 years. I was a federal public defender for 2 years. But during that period, I realized I really wanted to be able to do Section 1983 civil rights litigation as well. So I founded my own law firm 5 years into my career, had that law firm for 25 years. I did about 80% criminal defense, 4 to 5 days a week in court. I was a trial lawyer, and that was what I wanted to do, and that's what I did. Everything from underage drinking to triple murder, death penalty, homicide cases. Spent more than a year in jails interviewing clients, had more than 10,000 cases, did thousands of trials, etc. That's what I wanted to do, but I also, about 20% of my work was civil rights litigation with a specialty in the only form of accountability that existed in Philadelphia for law enforcement at that time, which was lawsuits against police who lied, cheated, stole, beat people up, framed them, and killed them. And I filed over 75 of those lawsuits during that time period. Needless to say, this is exactly the kind of career that endears you to the political insiders, but ran, won, ran again, won again. And the second time, of course, we were running on accomplishments as opposed to ideas. In Philadelphia, for a lot of reasons I could explain if we had more time, there really is a thirst for reform. It is the consequence of terrible stuff done by prosecutors and police in the past. Not all police, but some police. Not all prosecutors, but some prosecutors. So there really is a thirst. The problem I have is the problem, and I think this is true, Chesa has, is the problem that Monique has, and that is that we have what the people want, and so we will win elections. And the people who hate what we are doing know that we will just keep winning those elections, so they have to nullify those elections. They can't beat us in an election cycle, so they need to drive us out in between elections with recalls, with psychotic law in Florida that says the governor can nullify democracy. I am impeached as I sit here. I'm the first person in 342-year history of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania impeached for policies and ideas, and I'm not kidding. There is no allegation of crime. There is no allegation of corruption whatsoever. This is what people who really don't like democracy and certainly don't want to reform criminal justice are about, but understand they are losing. And they are losing in the sense that 11, 12 years ago, there really were not any areas of the U.S. where there was a progressive, or I would say a reform, prosecutor elected. 5 years ago, 10% of the U.S. population had done that. Right now, 20%. of the U.S. population has done that. This is not, in my opinion, a movement of progressive prosecutors at all. This is a grassroots movement for criminal justice reform that will take many different avenues, the first one being a crucial position, which is to get the lawyers in place that any movement needs to get it done, and those lawyers have been progressive prosecutors. But the reason that people who don't want reform, and those are institutional people, they are not the public, the reason that they are at us so hard and so bad is that not only do we actually threaten to change things in the most incarcerated country in the world, and I can get into my receipts for that later, not only do we threaten to do that, but we're a real electoral problem for them. Every time we run, reluctant voters who are broke, black, brown, and left come out and vote. We do, on the good side, what Trump did on the bad side. He got every white hood wearing, Duck Dynasty, right-wing nut to come out to vote. And the answer to that, and I say this as someone who voted for Joe Biden, is not Joe Biden. The answer to that is to take the people who do not trust government for very good reasons and do not trust politicians for very good reasons, to give them something to vote that they care about. And they care deeply about reforming criminal justice. So you ever wonder why they spend so much time going after us? Because if they can drive us off the ballot, there's going to be a whole lot fewer people voting on the Democratic and the left side.
I want to add, I have another question to follow up on that, but I want to add a couple other little pieces of information to follow up on what Larry and Monique said. First of all, just to dwell for a moment on Larry's impeachment here. Sorry, Larry.
I'm kind of proud.
One of the things that amazed me as a somewhat insider observer as the impeachment of Larry was playing out was not just the way it was coordinated to be part of a national Republican electoral strategy, to have that be a talking point in a national electoral cycle. That was sophisticated, but to be expected. What amazed me was the shamelessness and the brazenness of the Republicans who controlled Pennsylvania's lower house to impeach Larry, as he said, for no actual allegations of misconduct, for simply doing exactly what he had promised voters he would do, and for working as hard as he possibly could to deliver on those promises, which won him re-election. Well, simultaneously, this is the key part, while simultaneously turning a blind eye to a different elected district attorney in another part, a more conservative part of Pennsylvania, who was being prosecuted for rape allegedly committed while in office. But that district attorney wasn't worthy of impeachment, and he was. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Similarly, you would think that what happened to Monique in Florida would be a once-in-a-century, the kind of political maneuver that a governor would spend all of their political capital on, that they wouldn't be able to get away with it. Well, she was the second of two prosecutors that Governor DeSantis decided he was simply going to remove from office, notwithstanding their election by large margins, notwithstanding the fact that they were doing their job by any reasonable metric. However you want to measure performance or outcomes in ways that are more effective and more consistent with their campaign promises than numerous other elected state's attorneys in the state of Florida. So we are dealing with a situation where, as Larry says, the facts on the ground are so unbelievably distorted from what we learn in a place like Berkeley Law School about democracy. And at the risk of talking about San Francisco too much, I want to just add that though my recall was democratic in the narrow sense, we actually won more votes opposing the recall and a higher percentage of the vote opposing the recall than we had to get elected in 2019. And that's despite governing through a pandemic, a $10 million attack campaign. None of that is part of the narrative that you hear or see when you talk about criminal justice in mainstream media. And none of that, sadly, is part of the narrative when we look at what's happening in the recall attempt in Alameda County, where we all live, work, and vote. And so I want to encourage people to really pay attention, look below the surface at what's driving these attacks, these recall efforts, these summary removals. And I want to come back for a moment to this topic about Alameda DA recruiting folks, hiring folks, about Larry and his team being here to hire folks, about Monique surely recruiting to hire as soon as she wins her job back. I look around the room and I see a lot of students who I'm getting to know. And I see students who are really committed in some cases to being public defenders. And so I want to ask both Monique and Larry to talk for a minute about why a student who sees themselves as a public defender. That's how I started my career. I spent years, like Larry, defending people accused of crimes. I loved going to the jails. I loved thinking about, as Monique did, how can we prevent wrongful convictions. I love being a trial lawyer. And there's a lot of students at Berkeley who are set on becoming public defenders. Why should they instead choose to be a prosecutor? Monique?
So I also spent 16 years as a professor telling people don't become prosecutors, become public defenders. So what I'm going to say now is going to be a reverse of that. And it's not because I am hypocritical and speak out of both sides of my mouth, but because when I was doing that, there was no such thing as progressive prosecution. There was no such thing as reforming the criminal legal system. So there was no reason that I would encourage people to go and become a part of the system that I saw as the problem. But now there is. Luckily for all of you, now there is. And there are a lot of different offices that you can choose to go and change the system in. And it's really, really important that you recognize that you know it. That's why we're here talking to you about it today. But you know that there are two differences, right? So you're going to have a law and order prosecutor's office and you're going to have a reform prosecutor's office. And it's really important that you know the difference, that when you apply, you know what type of office that you're going to go work for. I interviewed a lot of people coming out of law school who didn't know what kind of office that I had and that I was running. So it's really important that you know what are the values of the person who is elected in your office? What did they run on? What did they promise their constituents? What is the method of prosecution that they're using? Do they have any diversion programs? What do they think about mass incarceration? These are all questions that you can ask when you are interviewing. Do they believe that mass incarceration is a thing? Should we be making it better or should we be adding to it? Because these are the kind of things that you can do in the future to change the problems that are in this system by understanding and knowing what criminal legal reform is, understanding what the problems are and how they can be changed, understanding the disproportionate minority representation and what that means for us as a society, understanding how criminal convictions stop people from getting housing, from getting scholarships, and ultimately becoming productive members of our society. These are all things that you have the power to change as a prosecutor. So I want to take you back to a conversation that I had with my predecessor when I was getting ready to leave the University of Florida College of Law, and she invited me to come and be a director of her conviction integrity unit. And I said to her, I don't want to be a prosecutor. And she was like, no, this is different. Listen why. And she explained to me all the things that I could do in conviction integrity. And I was like, oh, well, that all sounds fascinating. I'm interested. But as I became the director of the conviction integrity unit, I realized that the power to change the system lied within the office of the prosecutor. That as a defense attorney, I could save one person at a time, one case at a time, one courtroom at a time. But as the prosecutor, I could set forth policy that could change the whole system, at least in my circuit. And that when I partnered with other prosecutors, like Chesa, like Larry, like Kim, that we could begin to change the entire face of criminal justice in this country. And that was very important work. So what I'm here to tell you today is not that being a public defender isn't important, but that being a prosecutor is as important, if not more important, because the prosecutor holds the power and the keys to the change that is so well needed in the system.
Thank you, Monique. I want to echo what she said and add that, and this is something I hope Larry can speak to a little bit as well, that, for me, one of the fundamental differences between the practice as a public defender and the practice of law as a prosecutor was that as a public defender, I had a duty to zealously advocate on behalf of individual clients. Essentially, they were my bosses. And that meant that I was fighting one case at a time. I was doing direct service work. It's a beautiful thing. I loved it. I encourage people that experiment with that to try it out for size. But when you go work for a prosecutor's office, you represent all of the people of your jurisdiction. It's a more abstract ethical obligation, and it means the decision about who your boss is becomes that much more important. Working for somebody like Monique or like Larry or like DA Price here in Alameda County is a very different experience than working for somebody who comes from, shall we say, a more traditional lock 'em up and throw away the key style office. And so do your research and think about what your values are and where you can find an office with the kind of mentorship and a kind of leadership that will make you proud to do the job. And if you find that office where there's a good fit with your values and the leadership of that office, the ability, as Monique just said, to effectuate system change, not just one life, one case, but structural change, is exponentially greater when you're in the office of the district attorney than when you're representing one individual person. I'm looking at one of my mentors from the San Francisco Public Defender's Office who's here with us today. And he and I have worked on cases together in which we have achieved the best possible outcome for clients who were facing life in prison. We've achieved dismissals or acquittals at trial. And as much as we might have celebrated that victory, we knew structurally that our client, in that case and so many others, were going back to the same communities that were underinvested, over-policed, without resources, without opportunities, and all too often we'd see them back in the criminal courthouse again in short order. The ability to change that systematically and structurally is something that I think Larry and Monique have found ways to do from within their office. Can you talk about that, Larry?
Sure. So let me give you some receipts and work back from there. But I do want to make sure you know that from 5, starting around 5 or 5:30 is happy hour. And at happy hour, Monique Worrell and I, and hopefully Chesa Boudin, will be available to discuss in a, how shall I put it, more familiar environment any of the questions you may have. Besides, you can go up to Helena or to Sarah and you can ask them to tell you the truth instead of listening to this. Where are we going, Helena?
It'll be 5:30 at Free House.
Free house. We believe in freedom. Okay, so here's the receipts, because we can talk in the abstract, but we can also talk in terms of receipts. During the 6 years that our administration has been in place, we have reduced the future years of incarceration in jail or in prisons by essentially 50%. 50%. The number of juveniles who are in custodial placements has been reduced by 80%. We're talking about going from something like 650 to 100 and something. Okay? When we talk about mass supervision, meaning excessive periods of probation and parole, that is down by 2/3. When we talk about pursuing the death penalty, one of my predecessors pursued the death penalty successfully 109 times in 19 years. 109 times. We have pursued the death penalty at this point 0 times and came in with 4 people who were noticed. In other words, notification that death penalty would be pursued. That was shoved into our hands by our predecessor on purpose and shortly before we got there. These are numbers, right? Who cares about numbers? You don't see faces, but I see faces. We have 35,000 cases a year. Those 32 people who got exonerated, they have names and they have faces. Those juveniles who are in a healthier environment rather than being in a play jail cell for $225,000 a year, where they do not get a good education, they often get abused, and they come out and commit crimes again, they're not there anymore, okay? I spent 30 years as a criminal defense attorney. I worked diligently, and the only thing that happened on a national basis was that mass incarceration got worse the entire time. Why? Because I didn't sit in the seat of the people who had the power. That's the bottom line. That is the bottom line. There are wonderful reasons to be a public defender. I did it for 30 years. Some of you have thought about it for 30 minutes. Congratulations. But there are wonderful reasons to be a public defender. Bob Listenby was a public defender for almost all of his career. And you can do incredible things, but you will not change the world. You will not. Public defenders, criminal defense attorneys, civil rights attorneys, we did not reverse this. The way that you reverse this is that district attorneys have so much power that they can take that car, which has been speeding towards hell, they can do a quick U-turn, and they can jam on the gas, and they can reverse mass incarceration, mass supervision. They can reverse the incarceration of innocent people in the place of the people who committed those crimes just as quickly as it went the wrong direction. There is a moral choice to be made here, okay? You need to settle whether you are willing to give up a prosecutor's seat to the people who have traditionally sat in those seats. People like Josh Hawley, people like Ted Cruz, people like Tom Cotton, people like Meatball Ron. You need to decide, my virtuous ones, okay, I'm gonna wave my virtue flag. I got 30 years of virtue here. You need to decide, virtuous ones, about whether you're so virtuous that you want scumbags making these decisions, or you would like someone who believes in science, who knows a little bit about history, who has an intact moral compass, who knows this is a racist society, sitting in those seats and trying to take the number of people in jail and shrink it dramatically to that much, much, much smaller number who actually should be there. Now, having said that, A, don't go work for a traditional prosecutor's office, they're rotten. B, if you truly could not send someone to jail, then you should be a public defender, and we rely on truly excellent public defenders. We can't talk to your clients. We can't do their mitigation package. We can't be the ones rushing out to get the exculpatory video that only your client knows about before it gets erased. Public defenders are essential. They do God's work as far as I'm concerned. And they are essential to our ability to try to do justice. So if you truly can't send somebody to jail, be a public defender. But if you are someone who feels like you could do both things, then I hope you will at least consider that there is a sweeping impact to being a reformed prosecutor that simply is not there because of the way the system has been constructed. And we don't need Josh Hawley sitting in that seat. We need you sitting in that seat.
So as we think about individual careers, as we think about the progressive prosecutor movement as one current within a broader national criminal justice reform movement, Monique, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the Prosecutors Alliance of California and about your affiliation with it, and about how students who are interested, while they're still students, can get involved with the Prosecutors Alliance.
Yeah, so I am working as a national policy consultant with the Prosecutors Alliance. We're going to talk, I think, at some point about how I came to do that as opposed to being the elected prosecutor in the Ninth Circuit. But currently I'm working as a national policy consultant with Prosecutors Alliance, and they are focused on the work of prosecutors who are focused on reform. And that's really, really important because as Larry and some of my other colleagues started this reform named work back in 2011, 2016, and so on and so forth, there was no organizations in place to support that work. They were essentially on an island and had only each other to speak to across country about that work and the importance of that work. And what Prosecutors Alliance does is it serves as a support system by doing legislative actions, by putting together information that's necessary. And the most important work that they do that, as it relates to all of you, is that they also have student-based chapters. Student-based chapters of the Prosecutors Alliance where you all can form your own chapters at your law school of people who are interested in supporting the work of reform prosecutors and bringing in people to talk about the area of reform prosecution and how important it is to get people interested in that as a career path. So Christina's here, and she is the director, as Chessa mentioned earlier, and I highly encourage you all to speak with her, or if you're not able to speak with her after, talk to myself or Chessa afterwards about how you all might be able to form a chapter of Prosecutors Alliance student chapter here at Berkeley.
Thanks, Monique. Larry, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but you faced impeachment, you faced an election, a re-election in which all the newspapers said you didn't have a chance. They were publishing polls. They were saying that this guy, was his name? Carlos Vega, is that his name?
Carlos Vega.
Yeah, was going to win. And of course, voters overwhelmingly re-elected you. I want you to talk a little bit more explicitly on a couple themes you've touched on. The politicization of work that you do, which, as you said, is the academic consensus about evidence-based best practices, about the ways in which the media nationally and locally in Philadelphia has contributed to fear, not just in Philadelphia, but fear associated with reform, and maybe touch on why and how it is that the reforms you implement are, despite a lot of the fear-mongering, not in any way in tension with public safety, but rather policies you implement to make your community safer.
We'll try. Okay, so, big picture, for 30 years, crime was going down in the United States. For 30 years, on average, 65% of the U.S. population believed it was going up, year after year after year after year. How is it that we live in a country where it was going down for 30 years, but the population was so brainwashed that crime was going up all those years? How did that happen, and what were its consequences? The answer is that we have a troubling and symbiotic relationship between media, both news media and entertainment, and politics, and especially recently money, that the institutions like the machine they built. And the machine that they built has served the political ambitions and aspirations of DAs, and that's mostly what they're about, honestly. Mostly they're about advancing themselves in a way that turns out to be horrible policy and really good politics. You want a salient example? Check on an article by The Third Way, which is a sciencey, nonpartisan organization. They looked at all the states that vote for Mr., quote, law and order, unquote, Donald Trump. Yes, it's sticking in my throat because he stands for neither one. But look at the states that voted for Trump and the ones who voted for Biden. The Trump states have a 40% higher rate of murder. The Trump states have a 40% higher rate of murder. Where'd you get that from the mainstream media? When did they tell you that right-wing Republicans are terrible at public safety? Where was that messaging coming either from mainstream politics or the mainstream media or coming from anywhere? And the answer is it wasn't. The people are smarter than that, frankly. And for those of you who have seen the recent polling about how much faith African Americans have in news media, I think the number was about 18% trusted. Now, why do you think that is? How could that have happened? How did we get here? The reality is what bleeds leads has been central to making money in media for a long time. Doesn't necessarily mean they're lying. I'm not saying that. When they talk about a terrible crime that occurred, a horrific crime, they may be telling the absolute truth about it. But what they will never put at the end of it is this. Homicides are down in Philadelphia 20% this year. Did you know? You probably didn't, but I'll ask, did you know that we are looking at the biggest one-year decline in homicides in the history of recording crime in the United States this year? Did you know that? Or are you getting a steady diet of crime is worse, you're more unsafe, look at this terrible crime? You will never read in those articles talking about those terrible crimes, no matter how truthful they are. The big picture, the big context, what criminologists have to say, you're never going to see it. You're going to hear from Tucker Carlson. And he's going to have a screen behind him, and they're going to show you something scary. Because the institutions are and have been all about a politics of fear, all about their own ambitions, all about perpetuating themselves, and not at all about what this country needs. We don't have a problem at all with the average voter. That is why we've gone from basically 0% of the U.S. population having a progressive prosecutor to 20% of the U.S. population having a progressive prosecutor who control 30% of all the criminal cases in the space of 10 or 12 years. We don't have a problem with the people. We got a problem with the institutions who don't want to see it change. So, that is really what we are up against. That is really what all of this is about. And that's why you have this anomalous, weird scenario where all of us are really good at winning elections. So they got to do something to us in between elections, which only institutional players can do.
Thanks, Larry. I want to ask one more question for Monique, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Monique, we've talked about this a little bit, but I want you to unpack the Florida law that allowed Governor DeSantis to remove you from office, what that process looks like, what legal remedies, if any, are available to you and Andrew Warren, who was similarly removed, and what's happened to your office, the office you were elected to lead, since Governor DeSantis was able to appoint an undemocratic crony in your place.
So I want to start by saying there is no Florida law that allows the governor to remove me from office, which is why my removal was both illegal and unconstitutional. We're in a really scary place. And I don't want to be the media and, stroke fear, but the governor of Florida is running for president, okay? And the governor of Florida is an authoritarian. And he believes that he can remove anyone who is not politically aligned with him. And that is of great concern and should be of great concern to everyone across the country, because while people believe very strongly that Trump will receive the Republican nomination, the reality is he might not. Not because people won't vote for him, but it's kind of difficult to do that if you're in jail. So I think that people really need to take seriously the potential for DeSantis to become the Republican nominee. And just as Trump's candidacy called upon a certain part of the country, that DeSantis's will as well. And the reason that's problematic is this. I won my election by 67% of the vote. 397,000 people voted for me to become the state attorney. And not because I hoodwinked and bamboozled them and told them that I was going to be a law and order state attorney, and then I came in and did reform, and the governor needed to swoop in and save the voters from themselves. They knew who I was, and they elected me to do exactly the things that I said that I would do. So let's talk a little bit about the governor's executive order removing me. What he said was, comparatively speaking, I incarcerated less people than any other jurisdiction in the state. And because of that I neglected my duty as prosecutor. Well, I encourage you all to read the American Bar Association standards for a prosecutor. I don't have a duty to maximize incarceration rates. That is not a duty of an elected prosecutor. And what the governor failed to do was correlate how my failure to maximize incarceration rates led to an increase in crime. And the reason that he failed to do that is because it didn't exist. Crime was lower in my jurisdiction than it had been in the previous 20-year period, because we focused on people and not prison. We focused on programs that had been proven to help people become productive members of society. We focused on treating children like children and not this legal fiction of calling a child an adult for the purpose of prosecution. We focused on homelessness and how we shouldn't be criminalizing homelessness and mental illness, but instead working with our different agencies so that we can provide resources to those individuals. So yes, I did not maximize incarceration, but also crime was lower than it had been in the previous 4 administrations. So what we're dealing with is an attack on democracy, because in my jurisdiction, as well as the jurisdiction of my colleague, Andrew Warren, who was removed, those have the largest minority representation in the state of Florida. And what the governor did was he came in and said, your votes don't matter. And when we go into minority communities and we encourage them to cast their vote and tell them that their votes matter, what his actions did was say to them, no, they don't. And we have to ensure that sort of authoritarianism does not stand. We have to show him that this is a democracy and not a dictatorship, and that we believe in the free United States of America, and your sort of leadership is not accepted in this country.
Can I just comment on that? Is that all right?
Yeah.
I don't want to mess you up here.
No,
Jesse.
you're good.
All right, so in case you're wondering if it's just us, if we're special, number one, not only does Meatball Ron do this, but he is now trying to change the voting composition of both Tampa and Orlando so there will never be any sort of representation for the voters who put Andrew Warren there twice and put Monique Worrell there once. If you wondered what this is really about, you had any doubt about whether it's one more assault on democracy by a minority party that has lost 5 of the last 6 presidential elections by the popular vote and only hung on to anything by the Electoral College and being election deniers and so on, and trying to gerrymander and come up with, poll taxes or everything else they can do to disenfranchise people. He just told you. He just told you, now that I got him out, I'm going to change it so I can make sure that this large representation of minority votes will be drowned in a white jurisdiction. He just told you what he's doing, but it's not just us. It is also Georgia. Georgia has gone purple. It's gone from 1 progressive prosecutor to about 8 or 9. What did the Georgia legislature do for the first time in its history? It decided to come up with an unelected committee whose job it is to remove these prosecutors. These prosecutors, many of them are in smaller jurisdictions. Many of them are black. Many of them are women. All of a sudden, Georgia's worried about what its prosecutors are doing, not when they were doing the death penalty every 5 minutes, but all of a sudden, we got a problem here. And we need unelected people who don't even live in those jurisdictions, can't even vote in those jurisdictions, to do what with this committee? To remove them from office.
And keep them out, because
Or-
once they're removed, they can't be reelected for 10 years.
Right, or to discipline them. This is a straight-up fascist assault on democracy. It is also happening in Virginia. I could go on, but this is a playbook across the country. It's not actually just about us. You may have noticed that certain Republicans think it's a really good idea to indict Joe Biden for ... having a son? I mean, you may have noticed this. They've been softening the ground for authoritarianism, for the disenfranchisement of voters, almost always black, brown, young, broke voters. They've been doing this for a while. It is a national agenda. It's not just us. But they're coming after us with vigor, and they're coming after us because they know the voters that we're turning out, the voters who are starting to want to be involved in the system enough to vote again, and they also know that their agenda of doing things like eliminating abortion will not do well if you have progressive prosecutors who have discretion to choose what, where, when, and how they're going to prosecute. They know this. So that's really what's going on here. It's a whole lot bigger than just the 3 of us.
Yeah, and I want to just, before I open up for questions from the audience, I want to make absolutely crystal clear the trends and the pattern that we're describing here to you. In California, over the last several years, the jurisdictions, the counties with the highest crime rates have been controlled by red, literally Republican or extremely conservative, quote unquote, traditional district attorneys. Those are the counties with the highest crime rates, and with the crime rates that are rising the fastest. The counties with reform prosecutors are the counties that have lower crime rates, particularly lower violent crime rates, and that have falling crime. But when you look at Fox News, when you look at even allegedly mainstream, progressive, liberal Bay Area news sources, what you see them talking about is crime in Oakland, crime in San Francisco, crime in jurisdictions where we are implementing reforms. It is not an accident. It is not dissimilar from what Larry has dealt with in Philadelphia, from what Kim has dealt with in Chicago, from what Rachel dealt with in Boston, and it is not an accident. During the 2.5 years I was district attorney in San Francisco, overall reported crime, according to San Francisco Police Department statistics, fell by 20%. 20%. That's true for both violent and nonviolent crime. That's their own data. And that's not despite our efforts at decarceration. As you heard from Monique, it's in part because we started looking at alternatives to traditional conviction and incarceration that actually reduced crime and created a virtuous cycle. in which we saved money and invested in addressing root causes of crime. We reinstilled confidence in the integrity of the justice system in communities that for generations had been excluded and had no reason to trust law enforcement. And that process led to continuing declining crime rates, even as we decarcerated at every level of the system: juvenile, adult jail, and state prison population. You didn't hear people in national news or even local news talking about rising crime under those DAs who were still seeking the death penalty. Just didn't hear about it. And that level of media bias, that level of politicization of policies and practices that are not only overwhelmingly popular according to public opinion polling and elections, but also the consensus amongst researchers at places like University of California, Berkeley. That polarization and effort to make controversy is doing tremendous damage to the ability of folks like those people sitting next to me to actually do the jobs they were elected to do. And it's not an accident. So with that, let me encourage folks in the room who have questions. We've got about 20 minutes. I see a question here in the front row, and we'll go from there. Yes, sir. Not front row, sorry.
Hi, my name is Josh Kayatana. First of all, thank you all for being here. Appreciate what you've had to say so far. My question is, what has your office or former offices, what is their relationship and how has it changed with police departments in those jurisdictions? I see, just for context, my question, that in part your office's work requires a relationship with the department. But there's also been post-2020 an increasing willingness to prosecute police, to hold police accountable for their conduct. And then on the flip side, there's been increasing police backlash, retaliatory policing, closing ranks, even funneling money from the police unions into opposing elections. And with regard to your pitch about joining your office, I wonder, like, most of people's interaction with the criminal legal system has been through, unjust policing practices and not through criminal legal system as it comes to, not most people, but there's been a lot of attention focused on the police and not with unjust conditions as much. So curious, like, what your thoughts are on that and how your office is shaped, how your interaction shaped, and what you see the future of being.
So I'll take it because I have something hot off the press. If you all saw me looking at my phone while I was sitting here, my lawyers on my case just told me that the Sheriff's Association filed a brief on the governor's behalf. So it just happened while I was sitting here and I haven't had a chance to read it yet. So what was my relationship with them? Well, not very well. It was very difficult to police the police because for so many years and decades, they have policed themselves and they didn't want to be policed. And one of my first actions when I took office was calling the sheriff and saying, I'm looking at this body cam video of a gentleman who is in handcuffs sitting on the floor and being repeatedly poked in the head by one of your officers while others stood around and watched him doing it. And tell me, what have you done with regards to the battery that I'm witnessing that has taken place? And his answer was that he gave him 4 hours off with pay. So I prosecuted him because it was a battery. And that's what we do with people who break the law. But what that started was a, whirlwind of issues between me and local law enforcement because they started to spread the narrative that I was out to get them. And I wasn't out to get them, I was out to bring honor to the profession, because how can we entrust the lawless to enforce the law? If you're gonna break the law while arresting someone for breaking the law, then what makes you any better than they are? So it was very, very difficult. And as you can see by what I just said, they have, of course, joined forces because they want nothing more than me to stay out of office. And the individual who was appointed in my stead is someone who is very much, just gonna lay down and do whatever the governor says. I mean, interestingly enough, one of my opponents that I beat, the guy who actually came in last in my race, is the person who's now number 2 in the office, right? So it has been very, very challenging, and to a point where honestly I wish we could just make referrals to a different agency who would prosecute these cases, because it is difficult to have a relationship where we work collaboratively while also being in a position to having to review their misconduct.
I want to just echo one of the points Monique made before I pass the mic to Larry. First of all, the Police Officers Association in San Francisco spent nearly $1 million attacking me before I was even elected. And they did that in the course of about a month. And for point of comparison, they spent in 1 month as much or more than my campaign spent in the entire year of campaigning. So they didn't give me a chance to even file that first case before they came after me, right? And the kind of damage that they do when they're trying to undermine you, and we've all experienced this. The whisper campaigns where somebody in uniform who is the first point of contact that a victim of crime has with anybody from the state, anybody from the government, when they show up in uniform and say, ma'am, I'm so sorry for what happened to you. I wish we could help, but this DA over here, this Larry guy, don't forget to vote. They do that all across the country when there's an elected district attorney who believes in accountability. And it's really problematic because they will frame the kind of accountability that Monique just described to you, or the case that my office filed, the first ever in San Francisco history where an on-duty officer faced homicide charges for killing an unarmed black man. They will frame that as we're out to get the police, or we make it impossible to work with the police. This is the reality, and this is at the heart of your question, Josh. 99% of the cases that every prosecutor's office in the country prosecutes requires a police officer as a key witness to secure a conviction. And so it is imperative, if we're going to do our job, that voters in our jurisdictions, that the lawyers in our offices have confidence in the integrity of the officers who are responding to crimes, investigating crimes, and presenting evidence in our courtrooms. And when officers are allowed to get away with lying, stealing, and killing with impunity, the way the person who was summarily appointed to replace Monique or summarily appointed to replace me, who then dismissed every police case we filed, are allowing police to get away with murder. The way that Carlos Vega, who was trying to replace Larry, would, and made very clear to the police union, he would have allowed them to get away with murder with perjury. When that is allowed, it undermines not just the public's trust in the system in general, not just public safety because high crime communities stop calling the police, but it undermines our ability to secure convictions even in those most righteous cases. Because people don't trust police officers' testimony. Larry?
I think those are two great answers. They don't cover every little bit of turf, but let me just say this, from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock, we have office hours, right? Where? 136 office hours, and that's a great place to go right before you go to happy hour, which is where?
Free house.
Free house.
At 5:30.
And by the way, if you are alcohol-free, that just means you're smarter than other people. Please come. We would love to see you. It's a beautiful thing. We can talk more there, but I think there's other questions, so why don't we keep it rolling?
So, I guess just to play the devil's advocate a little bit, I agree with many of the premises of the progressive prosecutor movement. Like, I mean, there's a lot of money in playing cops and robbers, and, you know, it could be better spent. People should not have difficulty getting jobs and housing once they've done their time, and it really makes no sense to keep 60-year-olds in jail for crimes they committed at 22, but it just seems like the idea of a progressive prosecutor should be an oxymoron, because, you know, imagine if you had, like, a group of defense attorneys who got together and said, we're just gonna throw a bunch of cases. We're gonna get our clients a worse deal than we could have gotten. You know, send them to prison because we just don't like them as criminals. It seems like it's kind of a similar thing. Like, do you not have a duty to try to really throw the book at criminals and let the defense attorneys do their part, and you have this adversarial dialectical system, you know, from which justice will emerge? I mean, the prosecutor is not just the voice of the people or the advocate of the people, but the advocate of the crime victim as well. And so someone needs to really vigorously represent their interests as well.
So number one, I really appreciate the question. And I mean that sincerely. I'm not trying to shine you on. I appreciate it because we don't really get anywhere in this world if we don't have some direct communication. But my answer to you would be this. Number one, there's a completely different ethical obligation that defense attorneys have. Defense attorneys have an obligation to ethically and legally and zealously represent their client. As long as they ain't putting up perjured testimony and phony exhibits, they get to go in the hallway and high five when Charles Manson goes free. That's actually their job. That's what they're supposed to do. The ethical obligation of a prosecutor is completely different. It is an obligation to seek justice all the time. And that doesn't just mean for the victim, although that's incredibly important, or the witnesses. It also means the defendant. And it also means everybody who is not in that courtroom. That is the obligation. It is to seek justice. There is nothing about what we are doing that is throwing cases. What we are actually doing is trying to help victims the most important way you can by preventing the next victimization in ways that work. If you and I went to modern Germany right now, we would see a country that has only 11% of our incarceration, and they have only 11% of our homicides. You'd see a country where there is no death penalty and everyone is considered for parole after 15 years, even if they did a mass shooting. You would see a country where in a lot of these jails and prisons, there is no aspect that is explicitly punitive. It's entirely rehabilitative. I went to one where the inmates leave and drive home for dinner, and then after dinner they come back to the jail, okay? That is a system that works so much better than the system that we have here. All that we are trying to do is we're trying to prevent the next victimization. We're trying to do the things that actually prevent crimes from happening in the first place, things that we believe are much more effective than punishment, 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 and those things include prevention. Now, having said that, it has always been a focus of all the reform prosecutors I know to emphasize focusing on the most violent, terrible crimes, the ones that tear apart society. The loudest advocate for a $150 million forensics lab in the city of Philadelphia is me. And you're not going to hear the head of the Fraternal Order Police support it ever. I'm telling you right now, you're not going to hear that. Why is a longer question, but that's why we have office hours and happy hour.
I want to just add a couple points to that briefly. I mean, one is, as Larry indicated, you know, prosecutors don't represent the victim. And so while we do have an adversarial system, it is really important to be clear on what the role of the prosecutor is. It is not to be the lawyer for the victim. It's just not, ethically. Ask the Supreme Court, ask the model rules, ask the American Bar Association. And when we confuse that role, I think we run into really serious problems from the standpoint of the ethical obligation of a government law office. The second thing is that, you know, again, as Larry pointed out, there are different ways to measure justice. And in this country, for far too long, unlike other countries that are doing it better, we have chosen, myopically, to measure justice through years of incarceration, through pounds of flesh, without regard to evidence, without regard to what actually helps heal victims, or without regard to what prevents future crimes. And when we do that, we do ourselves a disservice and we undermine justice. So while you're absolutely right that it's important to play devil's advocate, it's important to think critically about what we are doing, it's also important that we recognize how the system is designed and the fact that the traditional prosecution model is an absolute aberration from what was designed in this country, from the way that the system is supposed to work. I guess the last thing I would say about it is, you know, to Larry's point about the crime lab, you look around the country and progressive prosecutors are the ones who are moving mountains to prioritize serious and violent crimes. And traditional prosecutors are the ones who believe in broken windows policing. They're the ones who think we should throw the book at people arrested for graffiti or for shoplifting or for possession of a drug pipe. You know, look at San Francisco. You know, they claimed that the overdoses from fentanyl were a result of my office's prioritization of drug treatment. So they started literally prosecuting people arrested with a pipe, arrested with personal use drugs in San Francisco for the first time in a decade. They're doing that now. And what's the result? Increase in fatal overdoses from fentanyl by 44%. I don't know if you have anything to add, Monique.
I don't.
I guess, like, one of the big things with progressive prosecution is kind of like the storytelling, and specifically like crime data, because it's so easy to tell so many different stories with the data. And I'm just wondering, like, from your perspective, are there any like techniques, or I mean, like how have you been able to, or I guess like
Oh, well, it is now. I mean,
I guess like what have you guys seen work? What have you guys done as progressive prosecutors to change that narrative?
So I was only in office for 2.5 years, but I did a lot of research on exactly what you're talking about during my time as a professor, right? I was at an institution, I had access to research and data and things of this nature. And these aren't things that we just woke up one day and said, hey, why don't we try this progressive prosecution thing out and see if it works? There is data that talks about the fact that putting children through the criminal justice system at a very young age increases the likelihood that they will grow up to be criminals. There is data that talks about how children of incarcerated parents will also grow up to be incarcerated. There's data that talks about how jail doesn't stop people from being addicted because, newsflash, they can get drugs in jail too, right? So there is research and data about all this, but I agree with you that we've not done a good job about putting out these crime stories, right? We've not done a good job about making this information available to people about why it's necessary to do this differently. Because the story about law and order and why a role of a prosecutor should be to throw the book at people, that story's been told for a very long time. And then people like Larry and Kim and Aramis and Sherry came along and said, we're gonna do it differently, but there was never a campaign that went ahead of them to say, here's why we should do it differently, and here's all of the data compiled to show you why doing it differently matters. Here's looking at how it's done in Germany and seeing how we can too, here in the United States, amass that type of crime rate and incarceration rate to make our country better. And that's one of the things that I'm proud to be doing with Prosecutors Alliance now, and that Chess is doing here at UC Berkeley, and many of the people who have left the path of being a progressive prosecutor are doing as well.
I don't have any, great answer here other than please come talk to us 3 to 5. Where is it again? 136? And then happy hour. But I will say this, my dad was an author and a writer. That was his career after he came out of World War II. And we have thought a lot about it. I think one of the things you have to realize is the system itself measures failure. It measures failure. You see somebody again in the criminal justice system if they violate probation or parole, or if they have a new case. You don't see them if they become taxpayers, homeowners, providers for a family. You don't see that kind of stuff. So we have to even look at some of the metrics, things like conviction rates. Guess what? Those conviction rates mean when you convicted an innocent person. You know what happens when I exonerate somebody and I let them go? I have a lower conviction rate because I dropped the case. Even the metrics themselves don't tell the full story. So you got to do two things. One is data, but we all know numbers just cause people to glaze over. The other is you do have to tell stories. I mean, there is a reason that the parables were short stories about moral principles, because people could remember them. You do have to find specific examples, tell real stories about real people, and you have to do it aggressively. The people are with us. The media is not. Teaching the media a new language is hard. But at least if we can try to figure out the things that motivate them, the ways that they can make money off of telling a more complete, a more positive, and a more contextualized story, if we can do that, we can get there. So final point is my office a couple years ago just decided we'd had enough, and we were going to out-media the rest of the city. Every Monday, we have a press conference. Something happens on a Wednesday, we have a press conference. On a Thursday, we have a press conference. We just put it out there. We put the info out there. Why? And we do it on social media. Because it gets to the people. Even if it comes through filtered, a little sideways, a little whatever, it gets to the people. And as long as the people see you're active, they see what you're trying to do, they may hear your stories even when the media doesn't fully get it, and that will change how people act.
final word here, folks. I think the issue around media and media bias is an incredibly important one. We have a research project at the Criminal Law and Justice Center on exactly that topic. We're also hosting an event tomorrow from 4 to 6, where we're bringing together journalists who cover crime